Tonight, we journey back to ancient Rome, into the twilight of a man once hailed as the voice of a nation. His words shaped empires, yet in the silence of betrayal, his voice would be silenced forever. This is the story of Marcus Tullius Cicero, philosopher, statesman, and defender of the Republic. A man who stood tall when others bowed, yet whose end came not with honor, but with blood. In the days of the dying Republic, Cicero's voice was unmatched. He had risen from humble origins, not of noble birth, yet his words carried more weight than the swords of generals. In the Senate, he thundered against corruption, against tyranny, against the ambitions of men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. To the people, he was a guardian of liberty. To his enemies, he was a dangerous obstacle. When Caesar fell, it was Cicero who spoke the loudest against Antony, warning Rome of a man who sought to rule not as a servant of the people, but as a master. His speeches, called the Philippics, were fire itself, praise for freedom, poison for Antony's name. Yet fire, once unleashed, always leaves ashes. Cicero's words gave Rome hope, but they also sealed his doom. For Antony, humiliated in the Senate, would never forgive the man who dared expose him before the world. Mark Antony was no ordinary enemy. He was power-hungry, cunning, and merciless. To him, Cicero was not just a political rival. He was a threat to be erased. In whispered meetings, Antony drew up lists of those marked for death, men whose influence or defiance stood in the way of his control. These lists, known as prescriptions, were death sentences made official. Cicero's name, once spoken with respect in every corner of Rome, now appeared inked among the condemned. His estates could be seized, his life taken, his head displayed as a warning. Rome, once his stage, had become his prison. And Cicero, for all his eloquence, could not speak his way out of the jaws of vengeance that now closed around him. In the quiet of his villa, Cicero walked the halls like a man already half dead. His library, filled with scrolls of philosophy and law, mocked him with the wisdom of ages. He had written of duty, of virtue, of the Republic's glory. But now, none of those words could shield him. Servants whispered of Antony's soldiers drawing nearer. Friends who once dined at his table stayed away, afraid to be associated with a condemned man. The Republic he had devoted his life to saving had abandoned him, leaving him not a hero, but a hunted animal. Cicero, who had commanded the Senate with his voice, now lived in the terrible silence of waiting for footsteps that would bring his end. In these final nights, Cicero often thought of his daughter, Tullia, the light of his life, who had died years earlier. Her absence haunted him more than the shadow of Antony's soldiers. If she had lived, perhaps he would not have felt so utterly alone. He would sit awake beneath the cold glow of the moon, whispering to her spirit, asking if he had done right, if his endless battle for liberty had been worth the cost. The philosopher in him sought reason, the father in him sought comfort. But the night answered only with silence. For Cicero knew the truth. No amount of wisdom could soothe the ache of loss, and no amount of courage could halt the hand of fate. Some begged him to flee. There was still time, they said. A ship could be arranged to carry him across the sea to safety, far from Rome and Antony's reach. But Cicero hesitated. Could a man who had defended the Republic his whole life truly abandon its soil to die in exile? He wavered, torn between survival and dignity. Yet even as he hesitated, the circle around him tightened. Antony's men moved swiftly, hunting down the proscribed one by one. Blood stained the streets of Rome as heads and hands were nailed to the rostra, silent trophies of tyranny. Cicero, too, knew his end would not come quietly, yet still he lingered, as though chained to the land he had loved too much to leave. At last, Cicero did attempt to escape. A boat was prepared to carry him to Macedonia, away from Antony's fury. The sea wind carried with it a faint promise of hope, the chance of one final chapter far from Rome's chaos. Yet fate is crueler than any enemy. As he stood on the shore, Cicero faltered. His body was weary, his spirit broken. Could he truly spend his final years as a wanderer, cut off from the land of his birth, the city whose every stone carried his voice? Slowly, he turned back, choosing not the uncertain mercy of the sea, but the familiar earth of Italy. It was a choice not of survival, but of surrender. Cicero would not run any further. On his final morning, Cicero took up a scroll and wrote his last words, not of despair, but of acceptance. He asked only that his death serve as an example, that the Republic, though broken, might one day rise again. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from age, for he was no longer the fiery orator of years past. He sealed the scroll, perhaps knowing it might never be read, yet feeling that a man of words must leave behind words, even at the edge of silence. For Cicero, to die without speaking would be a death unworthy of him. And so they came. Antony's soldiers, cruel and determined, rode hard through the countryside, their orders clear: bring back Cicero's head. They knew the price of hesitation. Failure meant their own death. The air was cold, the forest still, as hooves struck the earth in a rhythm that drew nearer and nearer. For Cicero, time had run out. There would be no escape, no last-minute deliverance, no miracle of survival. The hunters had found their prey, and all that remained was the final act of the tragedy. When the servants came to him, urging him to flee one last time, Cicero no longer resisted. His strength had faded, but his dignity remained. He allowed himself to be lifted into a litter, carried not as a senator in triumph, but as an old man retreating from fate. The villa, once filled with conversation, philosophy, and laughter, now stood silent behind him. Every stone seemed to whisper farewell. Cicero's eyes, though weary, held no terror. It was as if he had already made peace with what was to come. The road ahead was not long, yet each step felt heavy, burdened with the weight of a life lived in service to Rome. He was not running anymore. He was simply walking toward the inevitable end that history had written for him. The forest road was quiet, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the creak of wood as Cicero's litter swayed. But silence is always deceptive. Somewhere beyond the trees, the riders drew closer. Antony's men had tracked him with precision, guided by betrayal and whispers of frightened servants. In the distance, the glint of steel flashed between branches, and the dull thunder of hooves began to grow. The servants carrying Cicero faltered, their courage wilting as the sound of pursuit pressed nearer. Cicero raised a hand, as though to steady them, though he himself was too frail to stand without help. He had no illusions now. This was the final mile of his journey. Ahead waited no safe harbor, no sanctuary, only death, and the hope that death would at least come swiftly. And then the riders appeared. Antony's soldiers, grim and merciless, surrounded the litter in a storm of hooves and dust. Swords gleamed in the dim light, and there was no longer any doubt. The servants froze, trembling, but Cicero himself was calm. He ordered them to set the litter down. Slowly, with the dignity of a man who had faced Senate and people alike, Cicero stepped out onto the road. His cloak was wrapped around him, his face pale but unafraid. He looked into the eyes of the soldiers, not as a pleading victim, but as a Roman. For a lifetime, his weapon had been his voice. Now, with no words left to save him, his silence carried more strength than the blades raised against him. Accounts tell us that Cicero did not beg, nor did he attempt to flee. Instead, he stood tall in the only way left to him. He raised his chin, exposing his neck, offering it freely to the executioners. "There is nothing proper about what you are doing," he is said to have told them, "but do try to kill me properly." His words, quiet yet cutting, pierced deeper than any sword. The soldiers, hardened by bloodshed, hesitated. For in this frail old man stood the last breath of the Republic, and even in his surrender, he carried the weight of dignity that Antony himself could never claim. The hesitation did not last long, but for that brief moment, Cicero's courage shamed his killers. And so it ended. The blade came down, swift and brutal, and the man whose voice had once commanded Rome was silenced forever. His body crumpled, but his face, witnesses said, remained serene, as though even in death he refused to grant his enemies the satisfaction of fear. Cicero was 63 years old, an age when many might hope for peace, but in a world torn by ambition and war, peace was a gift denied to him. His servants wept. His killers did not linger. The order had been carried out, and Antony's vengeance was complete. Yet even as Cicero's blood darkened the earth, his spirit lingered, carried not in body, but in the words he had given Rome, words that no blade could truly erase. The cruelty did not end with his death. Following Antony's command, the soldiers severed Cicero's head and hands, the instruments of his speeches, the voice and the pen that had defied tyranny. They carried them back to Rome, a grim offering for a vengeful master. In silence, the countryside watched them pass. Some turned away in horror, others wept, but none dared intervene. It was not merely Cicero who was slain that day. It was the last breath of Rome's free republic. His remains were trophies, meant to send a message that no man, no matter how wise, could defy the march of tyranny and live. In the heart of Rome, upon the rostra where Cicero had once stood to deliver his greatest speeches, his severed head and hands were nailed for all to see. The people gathered in horrified silence. This was the very platform where he had defended liberty, condemned corruption, and inspired hope. Now it displayed the brutal triumph of cruelty over reason. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight. Others wept quietly, remembering the voice that had once spoken for them. Yet none dared speak aloud, for fear gripped the city tighter than chains. Rome had not only lost a man, it had lost its voice. And in that silence, tyranny grew stronger. Antony believed he had destroyed his greatest enemy. With Cicero's head on display, he thought fear would silence all dissent. Yet Antony did not understand the power of words. Scrolls may burn, voices may be cut short, but the ideas they carry cannot so easily be killed. Even as flames consumed Cicero's writings, copies survived in hidden libraries, carried by students and admirers who refused to let his philosophy die. Antony's shadow loomed large, but it could not eclipse the light of Cicero's thought. In death, Cicero had achieved what no tyrant could steal: immortality through words. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, yet Cicero's voice endured. His words found their way into monasteries, universities, and libraries. Generations of thinkers, philosophers, and leaders turned to him, learning from the man who had lived and died for the Republic. From Augustine to Petrarch, from Enlightenment scholars to modern statesmen, Cicero's influence stretched across time. Though Antony's sword had cut his flesh, it could not silence his wisdom. In the stillness of candlelit studies, his thoughts came alive again and again, a whisper from the ancient world reminding humanity of the fragile bond between freedom and power. And so, as we close our eyes tonight, let us remember Marcus Tullius Cicero, not merely for his tragic death, but for the life he gave to words. He was flawed, as all men are, yet his devotion to the Republic was unwavering. He chose not the safety of silence, but the peril of truth. In his courage, we find a lesson that words hold power greater than any sword, and though tyrants may silence voices, they can never kill the ideas those voices carry. Cicero's body rests in the soil of Italy, but his spirit lingers in every speech, every book, every whisper for freedom across the centuries. His last breath was not the end, but the beginning of an eternal echo. And now, as you drift into dreams, let his story remind you that though darkness may reign for a time, light always finds a way to endure. Sleep well, traveler of history, and good night.